The NFL draft is over. One of my favorite times of the year. It's what brings teams some hope. What you see all these young guys coming in, what they could be, what your team could become. Every team has the highest level of optimism after the draft. I'm here to crush some of that optimism. Not for every team though. In this video, I'm going to go over my biggest winners and my biggest losers. Now, if your team isn't mentioned, that doesn't necessarily mean I didn't like them or I did like them. I'm just kind of going over the biggest ends of the spectrum. Which teams crushed the draft and which teams crushed their fans' dreams and have to wait another year for the optimism to come back. So let's get into it. If you guys like the video, please just like the video. Subscribe. I'm going to come out with a few more videos going over the draft, a few more videos going over some headlines for the season. And yeah, my first winner will start off the first pick of the draft, the Chicago Bears. The Bears didn't come into the draft with many picks. They had 4 to begin with. They ended up trading back in at the end, so they had 5 total. Now, obviously, we know the Bears were going to take Caleb Williams. That makes them a winner no matter what. But that's not really why I'm making this video. But I don't really think I need to go too much in depth about Caleb. If you pay any attention to college football and drafts, you know why Caleb is the number 1 prospect. If you already like him, anything I'm going to say is not going to change your mind. If you don't like him, same thing. I'm not going to change your mind. You just have to see him play. But they got their franchise QB of the future. What happened after Caleb is what I think makes the Bears a true winner. Getting Rome Odunze at number 9. Now, taking Rome there wasn't rocket science. But sometimes these teams like to overthink. You know, it'd be very easy for the Bears organization to look at their team and be like, oh, we already have DJ Moore. We already have Keenan Allen. We got DeAndre Swift, some tight ends. Let's not invest in the offense anymore. And I think that would be a huge mistake because surrounding these young QBs early on is what I think is one of the biggest factors of what allows them to develop into a good quarterback. That's something I've kind of have a theory on, that all these highly ranked quarterbacks, whether they thrive or fail, the biggest factor is actually their surrounding cast during their first couple seasons. Plus, if you look at the Bears roster, Keenan's getting older. You know, he's not that young guy anymore. He has 1 more year on his contract. So in theory, he's only there for 1 year. Then Rome comes in as your number 2, and you're all set. Even if Keenan does stay, just having Rome, developing as a number 3, that's a pretty good problem to have. Then with their 3rd pick, they grabbed the offensive tackle out of Yale. Now, he's definitely a project, and you don't really see him starting for probably at least 2 years. He also didn't play a ton of Yale, but he is a massive individual. And not only is he massive, but he's also very athletic for his size. So he passes the eye test, and there is some stuff that if you get him to develop, he could become a legit star tackle in this league. Then they picked up the punter. I'm not going to go too much into detail about that, but then they also got a pass rusher at the very end of the draft. Now, we'll see how Booker kind of progresses as a pass rusher, but for a 5th round flyer, he's very athletic, very twitchy athlete. He already has a good set of pass moves that if he can just develop them, he could become he could niche himself a legit role in the league. So this is one of those drafts that if everything kind of falls into place, this draft will be looked at for the Bears in the next 10 to 15 years on why they all of a sudden got so much success. So then we'll go to the first loser on the board. And I don't really think anyone's surprised about this. And I don't really think their own fans will be mad about me calling them a loser. It's the Falcons. They're the losers of the draft. And it all revolves around the Michael Penix Jr. pick. Here's the thing. Whether you liked Penix as a prospect or not, And I personally didn't love him. I understand that QBs will go higher than their grade because of the value of the position, but I didn't see him as a first round talent at all. The fact that the Falcons are a team that just gave Kirk Cousins a massive contract shows to me they think they're contenders, right? That they're a QB away from being a contender. So then you have this 8th overall pick, and you have a couple edge rushers available. You have some defensive linemen available. Rome Odunze was still available to make him your wide receiver number 2. And they go Penix. And I know the GM was talking about wanting to follow the Green Bay model of drafting a QB, letting him sit a few years. But I don't think that model works in this situation. Because what the Packers did differently when they took Love, for example, they took him like 25-ish pick, right? Around that like mid to late 20s. Not 8th overall. And the thing with Penix is he's going to be 24 next month. So he'll be 24 at the start of the season. So by the time that he's starting, he might not be 26 to 27. That's not really what you want out of a guy who's starting his first starting gig. Someone that should be in their prime, theoretically. I could go on and on why I think that was such a bad pick, but when you looked at the guys that were available, defensive players or even offensive players that could impact their winning immediately and help push them for a Super Bowl contender, this pick straight up made them a loser of the draft. Now, the rest of the draft wasn't terrible. Rook, that's all I'm going to say because I'm going to botch his name. I looked into him. I think he's a pretty solid defensive tackle. He seems like a very good run defender specifically, but I don't really think he should have been 35th overall, and they traded up to get him. So I thought that was a reach, but I think the player himself isn't terrible, but he wasn't even the best defensive tackle available. Then they went after Braylon Trice and Brandon Dorless. Both guys that won't be game changers, but they'll help the depth of the defense. And the rest of the guys, they had some decent players that went. But again, they won't be game changers. They'll just be some depth pieces for now. I just truly think that their short-term impact they made from taking Penix at 8 overall significantly hurt their chances of making a Super Bowl run or even an NFC Championship run. And that by itself makes them one of the losers of the draft. On to another winner. We're going to go to the Minnesota Vikings. Now, the Vikings were another team that had very little early on picks, but they made them count. So they took J.J. McCarthy, 10th overall. And I know some people are split on McCarthy. I think he shows some good traits just as a prospect. When you look at his arm strength, some of his mechanics, some of his actual physical skills, I see a good prospect in him. We just don't really know how it translates onto the field yet because of how little he had to do at Michigan. Michigan was a powerhouse. They were winning almost all of their games by the end of definitely at the halftime. I mean, most of the time by the end of the first quarter they had a good lead. So we really didn't have to see him go through football adversity and go out and win games too often. He only threw the ball 22 times per game. That might be doubled in this Minnesota offense. But the reason I picked them as a winner from the J.J. McCarthy standpoint was most of the talk was about them getting him after trading up to 4 or 5. And while I understand why they would have done it, because, again, these QBs go higher than they should because of the positional value, they stood their ground, they waited, and they still got him. That, to me, already makes them winners. They only had to move up one spot. They really didn't have to give up anything to get him. Then they traded back into the first and picked up Dallas Turner, a guy who was projected in a lot of mock drafts to be top 10. He was one of the best edge rushers in the draft this year, arguably just one of the best defenders in general. So not only were they able to hold their ground and not give up a big ransom for McCarthy, they were then able to just use some of those resources that they would have put into that to then get Dallas Turner. So their first round was phenomenal. They pretty much put all of their resources into getting those two guys. The rest of the guys they got probably won't be too big of impact players. I do like the corner out of Oregon, Kyrie Jackson. He's definitely not perfect as a prospect. He has a lot to work on, but he has some good physical traits that he can, if he's coached right, I think he could be a decent corner in this league. He won't be like a number one shutdown guy, but he can make an impact. The rest of the guys, Roos, the tackle out of Oklahoma, they went kicker. They got some unoffensive linemen and defensive linemen. Most of those guys are just role players or depth pieces. So basically, the reason the Vikings are winners because of the value they got at not trading back from McCarthy and then able to get Dallas Turner at the middle of the first. So on to the second loser of the night, a team that I just feel like cannot do anything right, and I almost feel bad bashing on them, but it's the Carolina Panthers. Now, the Panthers were already a big talking point in a bad way about this draft because that should have been them picking number one overall. But besides that, that's not why they have a loser grade. It's just because of their decisions in the picks. So they traded back into the first round with the Bills for pick 32, the very last pick of the round, to pick Xavier Legette. Now, Legette has a lot of good physical traits that does make him very attractive. He is very athletic, but he's also very raw. His route running is extremely limited. There's a lot to work on. He's one of those guys that you see him as an athlete and hope he turns into a wide receiver. And that can work, but it also can backfire a lot. And we saw it last year with the Panthers and Mingo. Now, maybe Legette turns out to be a phenomenal receiver and proves me wrong. I hope it does. But to me, when you look at the other receivers that were on the board, I either would have picked one of those guys, Ladd McConkey and A.D. Mitchell. I had both of them above Legette. Or I would have not traded up or even traded back some to still get Legette. Then they picked Jonathan Brooks, the running back out of Texas. Now, I actually really like Brooks. I think he's arguably the best running back in this draft. But the reason I don't like this pick for the Panthers is just the value of running back for teams that are shit don't help. Running backs don't turn shit teams into average teams. Running backs turn good teams into great teams. They help you put over that hump, but they don't turn a franchise around. And we've seen it before. I mean, with the Panthers, CMC couldn't turn the Panthers around by himself. Barkley, Giants still suck, even though Barkley was great. I only think running backs should be invested in, whether it's with high draft capital or money or trades, if you're a team that's close to being a contender. Look at the 49ers with McCaffrey. Look at the Eagles grabbing Barkley. I like those moves. But if I was the Panthers, I wouldn't have taken a running back this high. If you take one, you take them 5th, 6th, 7th round, a flyer, because we've seen a lot of late round running backs work out too. So I like Jonathan Brooks, the player, not the pick for the Panthers. I didn't mind their 3rd and 4th round pick. Trevin Wallace, the linebacker, I think he's pretty versatile. I think he'll be able to make some plays on that defense. So I like that. And I like Javonte Sanders. I think, he has... he's one of those tight ends that you can kind of move to different points on the field to help. But neither of those guys are going to be true game changers probably. You could make an argument the best moves of the Panthers today or this weekend was when they traded back in the 2nd round with the Rams to get an extra 2nd round in 2025. That was probably their best move, and that's usually not a good sign. So Panthers are my second loser for today. So my third winner, and I am a homer, but I think I'm being completely rational about this, are the Steelers. And I could go into probably a 20 to 30 minute video on why I loved the Steelers draft so much, but I'll try to keep it about the same length as other teams. The Steelers had three major positions of need that they needed to find starting caliber players in this draft. And in my opinion, this is in order to. They needed a center, they needed a wide receiver, and they needed a tackle. They had all three positions in the first 3 rounds. Well, not necessarily in that order, but the order went perfectly for them. So they went Troy Fortunu, the tackle out of Washington. He was probably like the 5th best tackle, give or take, depending on what you thought. But this tackle class was super deep. He wasn't expected to fall to the Steelers in most mocks. So they saw him, and they pretty much had a choice. They could either go him, they could go one of the 3 centers that were available, or one of the many wide receivers. So they realized the value of taking him because the other 2 positions were so deep, they should go Fortunu. So they went there. And then in the second round, I follow a lot of Steelers beat reporters, and they all wanted to trade up in the second to make sure they either got Jackson Power Jr.'s or Zach Frazier, the 2 centers that made it to the second round. But they stood put, they held their ground, and Zach Frazier ended up falling to them. And I think he is a perfect fit for the Steelers. He is a very physical, very tough center. Then they got Robin Wilson in the third, the wide receiver out of Michigan. I'm not crazy high on him as a wide receiver, but I do think this is probably one of the best spots he could have gone to. He is extremely fast. He is a burner. But the biggest thing with him is he is very physical, very tough. His slogan is, "Don't block, don't get the rock." He just wants to push people around out there. And for a Steelers team that's going to be very run heavy, that is a massive get. So they buffed up their offensive line significantly. They got another receiver that fits their system perfectly. Peyton Wilson, the linebacker at NC State, if it wasn't for his injury history, he probably would have been the number 1 rated inside linebacker in this class. He is a freak athlete, but he doesn't have an ACL in one of his knees. He's had some injury history, of course, so there is some risk there. But in the 4th round, sometimes you got to swing for those boom or bust guys. And then they got a guard, a defensive tackle, and a cornerback. None of those 3 will be game changers or probably starters for the Steelers this year, but all 3 should add some depth. So as a homer, I could not be more happy with the Steelers. And I think every expert I've seen, everyone I've seen talk about winners and losers, giving out grades, the Steelers won the draft. So my last loser of the weekend would be the Denver Broncos. And I hesitated putting them on the loser list because after the first round, I wouldn't say I hated their draft. But their first round pick, kind of similar to the Falcons, brought the whole thing down to me. As most of you or all of you probably know, they took Bo Nix, 12 overall. Now, to me, Bo Nix, similar to Penix, was not a first-round caliber quarterback. I would probably say he was the 6th best quarterback in this draft. I mean, that is where he went. To me, he's older. He doesn't have He doesn't have like a big upside, a big franchise-changing skill set. At best, he might become like a solid game manager. But becoming a game manager when the roster is terrible around you is pretty tough. So to me, I think the Broncos would have been better off just getting best player available at that pick. You know, whether it was going defense, whether it was going tackle, you know, the top 3 receivers were gone. They could have traded back for some more picks in the second round. Those all would have been good moves. Instead, they just kind of pulled the trigger on a quarterback that won't change their franchise, and their franchise isn't even ready to support. So I'm out on Bo Nix. I'm out on the Broncos as a whole, but we'll go over the rest of their picks. They picked Jonah Ellis, the edge rusher out of Utah. I think he's going to be solid. He's very high energy, I think he's always going to have like a big motor to go. Whether or not he'll become like a legit, threat to be a pass rusher, or if he's just a rotational pass rusher, that is to be decided. But I think he had decent value. They went Troy Franklin, the wide receiver out of Oregon, at the 102, and I love Troy Franklin, actually. I had him, I think, my 7th ranked wide receiver, and he went way later than that. The only thing I have against Franklin, and I said this in my wide receiver prospect video, is I think if he's your number 2 and he doesn't have a ton of pressure on him, he'll be extremely productive. But if he's a number 1 and he has to deal with doubles or the best corner on a defense, he's going to struggle because of his lack of physicality. And while technically Courtland Sutton is the number 1, he's getting older. There have been trade talks about him. So we might very well see Troy Franklin thrusted into the number 1 spot, and I do think he struggles. But I like Troy Franklin a lot. The rest of their guys, they went running back and another receiver. They got a corner and a center. I think, kind of similar to the other ones. They might added a little bit of depth to their team, which they needed because they ended up cutting a lot of people because of salary cap reasons. But I just don't really think they went into the direction of building a good foundation on their team. So then my next winner will be the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, when they went Joe Alt at number 5, to me, I was like, they're not a winner. I wouldn't say they're a loser, but they weren't a winner. And that's nothing on Joe Alt. He is a generational prospect at the tackle position. Every team in the league would like to get Joe Alt. The reason I didn't like the pick, though, was because of Malik Neighbors being available. To me, the Chargers needed a receiver more than buffing the lineup. And they've already put a lot of previous draft picks into their offensive line. I understand Jim Harbaugh is going to want to have a smash mouth mentality, but they're going into the season with Joshua Palmer and Quentin Johnston as their only 2 receivers from last year. They lost Mike Evans, Keenan Allen. They lost Everett, their tight end. They lost Eckler, even though he was pretty bad last year as running back. Their offense was gutted. And you have a guy like Neighbors, who I actually had as my number 1 ranked wide receiver prospect, who could be a complete game changer, and he would have been phenomenal next to Justin Herbert. So when that happened, I was worried because I was afraid that we knew the top 3 receivers were going to be gone by the time their second round pick came up. I was afraid even more of that would be gone. But, they were able to land Ladd McConkey, my 5th rated wide receiver in this year's class, in the second round. And I think Ladd will thrive with Herbert. While Ladd doesn't have the, superstar potential as a Neighbors or even a Rome, Ladd can be someone that, if you tell me in a year or 2 he's getting 100 catches every year, I wouldn't be surprised. He's really good. So the fact that they were able to get their generational tackle and still land a great wide receiver prospect, to me, that brought them into the winner category automatically. Another thing the Chargers really did well was stocking up on their draft picks, because they were also one of those teams this year that had to cut a lot of people because of salary cap purposes. So they brought in Junior Colson, the linebacker out of Michigan, and I'm sure there'll be some people that don't really know much about him, and just saying that Harbaugh is being a homer, taking the Michigan guy. Colson is really good. I think he'll be a great pickup for that defense. They were also to get the defensive tackle out of Alabama. Someone's name I will botch if I try to say. They got 2 corners. They got Brendan Rice, Jerry Rice's son. He definitely is a flawed wide receiver, but he might find his way on the field anyways. And they also went another receiver out of Michigan. So they got 3 receivers this class. Even if, Ladd will hit, I don't see him being a bust. Even if one of the 2 guys becomes solid, that's still a win for sure. So the Chargers did a really good job at kind of retooling this draft after having such a rough offseason. And my last winner of today will be the Buffalo Bills. Now, the Bills didn't wow me with any one particular player, but what they did a really good job was, and I feel like a broken record, but they're also a team that had a really rough offseason because of salary cap issues. They had to cut a lot of people. So they definitely had some holes on their team to fill, whether it was starting roles or just some depth pieces. And by multiple trade backs, they were able to take 10 guys in this draft. So they started off by trading back twice in the first round and not picking the first round completely and taking Keon Coleman, the wide receiver out of Florida State. Now, I'm not the biggest Keon fan. He's another one of those receivers who has a lot of boom or bust potential. He's a prospect. His top end speed is not as good as you'd think. His route running is very lackluster, but he has a massively big catch radius and a great jump ball getter. So if there is one team that he fits perfectly on, it's the Bills. And while I didn't love him as a pick, I'm guessing the Bills are pretty set on taking him because that's why they probably traded back twice. And by trading back twice and still getting the same guy, not only did they get better draft positions later on, but they also have to pay him less because each time you get picked later on, your contract is less. So you got the same guy for less money and you improved your drafting positions later on. Cole Bishop, the safety out of Utah, I really like. He's one of those guys. He's all over the place in a good way. He is flying all over the field. Very high energy. He feels like he has to try his hardest on every single play. I think he'll bring some good intensity to that defense. They picked up the D tackle out of Duke, Carter. I think he'll just be a solid defensive role player on that D line. They got a center out of Georgia. I don't think he's ready to start this year, but he has some potential. Everyone kind of says that he's a center only. He doesn't really have the size or the skill set to play guard. But he's someone that they might be able to slot at center in the future. They picked up some other guys on defense, a linebacker, edge rusher, corner. They got 2 tackles. Like I said, they were just kind of retooling while still putting them in a position to compete in the AFC. And I think the Bills did a good job at that. So those are my losers and winners of this year's draft. One thing I noticed while I was watching the draft live, reviewing it after it was finished, reading some other people's opinions, reading about some of the players that I didn't really know too much about, is there was a lot of teams that just did a great job drafting this year. Whether it was just doing what they needed to do, getting a few solid players, whether it was making home run plays. I thought teams drafted extremely smart this year. And that made this video a little harder because even like I was going over my losers, some of the teams I didn't even want to put as losers, it's just for this year's draft, they were. There were a few other teams I didn't love what they did. I thought the Packers had a few picks that were just, weren't necessarily game-changing. And when you have Rodgers for only a year or two, I probably would have liked a little bigger of a splash. I thought the Packers had a reach in the first round, but they had some other guys they drafted later on that worked well. The Cowboys, probably could have had a little bit of a draft. And there were other teams that, honestly, I should have put in my winners bracket, but I already had 5 teams, and I didn't want to say half the league were winners. But teams like the Eagles, the Lions, really shored up some weak spots on their team. The Patriots, the Cardinals, and Washington all did a really good job at kind of retooling as bottom teams last year. And I think they could change their franchise around significantly. So, it's expected in a very deep draft, but I felt like more teams did really well than teams that did poorly.